Today, we will explore our natural tendencies to avoid or discount feedback, and more importantly, learn to embrace a mindset that actually values and welcomes feedback. Most of us are poor at receiving feedback because receiving both praise and criticism can feel awkward, so we avoid it. Some of us have even come to believe the adage, no feedback is good feedback. So let's take a look at how we can learn to view feedback as a gift for our growth and development. In many ways, receiving feedback well is even more difficult than giving feedback well. For both giver and receiver, our thoughts, emotions, stories, intentions, and body language often betray us. And what we hoped would be a good, constructive conversation ends with one or both parties feeling like an opportunity for growth was missed. This is a complex topic and an area for development most of us can work on for a lifetime. Today, we're going to focus on core issues that get in the way of receiving feedback and give you lots of practical tips and tools that you can immediately use on your journey to become a virtuoso in the art of receiving feedback. If there is a single core tension that makes hearing feedback feel very risky, it is the one depicted on this slide. This core tension runs deep. Our ego has a deep need to survive, and the high achiever inside of us wants nothing more for us than to grow and learn. One of our core survival needs is the need to be accepted as part of a family or group. This is hardwired, and the need harkens back to our tribal nature. It's the reason so many of us avoid feedback and live in denial of our blind spots. We fear that we will not like the feedback we hear, fear we will be shunned, or fear we will not be asked to the important meetings. Yet we do indeed swim in a sea of feedback. It cannot be avoided. It is both formal, like rankings and ratings, tracked wins and losses and ties, and it is informal, comments and offhand remarks, invitations extended or dropped, warm greetings or cold shoulders. We invite you to overcome your need to look good and have all the answers, and instead step into being vulnerable yet powerful in the positioning of welcoming feedback and seeking to improve yourself. This is the best way to speed your own growth and to role model it for those you lead. So let's jump in and look at some ways you can get better at this often ignored skill. As we learned in the Seeking Feedback mission, asking for feedback creates a toward state in our brain, a mentality in which you can actively seek out feedback rather than waiting with dread for it to come to you. Let's begin with truth triggers. Our challenge to see and hear feedback is legitimate. When feedback catches us off guard, the emotional sting can trigger a total rejection, and we lose any opportunity to benefit from the feedback. Even if the feedback was requested, if it strikes us as overly simplistic generalization, we might miss the value that a more nuanced critique could have provided. Remember, both the giver and receiver of feedback are biased by their stories. As author of our own story, we tend to write our characters as the hero, not the flawed villain who sometimes misses the mark. But when we reject feedback out of hand as just plain wrong, we miss any opportunity for growth and improvement. Many of us will need to admit we reject more criticism out of hand than is good for us. Let's look at how we can look for that golden nugget in any criticism. There's an old joke that goes like this. Worried that their son was too optimistic, the parents of a little boy took him to his grandparents' farm. In an attempt to dampen the boy's spirits with hard work, they showed him a barn stall piled high with horse manure. Told to clean it out, the boy didn't complain, but clambered to the top of the pile and began digging with excitement. "Why are you so eager?" asked the parents. "With all this manure," the little boy replied, beaming, "there must be a pony in here somewhere." When we feel a truth trigger and want to reject feedback out of hand, our challenge is to be like the optimistic little boy and look for the pony. If you're going to become a virtuoso at receiving feedback, you need to become a feedback sifter and sorter. Think back to any recent feedback that felt unfair or just plain wrong, and then reflect on other similar times when you took feedback poorly. Do you see any patterns? Have you ever sought out an honest second opinion? When getting a second opinion, be sure to ask an honest friend, not from someone who would tell you what you want to hear or what they think you want to hear. Here's a question worth pondering. The higher you rise in an organization, the more likely you are to be surrounded by people who agree with just about anything you have to say. What step can you take to cultivate more honest mirrors? Let's look at another way we can take advantage of the fact that people often see us differently than we see ourselves. People give us their interpretation of reality through feedback. This can be really valuable, even if their interpretation seems a bit off base. They are seeing some set of data differently than you. A smart feedback receiver asks good questions to dig deeper and find the truth in the feedback, even if it's given poorly. The trick is to probe to find meaning in their perception. Ask clarifying questions like, what do you mean when you say I come off as too strong sometimes? Or, tell me exactly what you mean when you say I need to improve my collaboration skills. This is the trick to seeing feedback as a gift. Only another person can share an outside perspective on your behavior. We all have blind spots and need to overcome it when someone shines a light on something we find difficult to see. Let's now turn to a second type of trigger, identity triggers. Let's talk about these identity triggers. Our identity stories keep us in a box. When we hear information that threatens our identity story, we get triggered, resulting in a range of feelings and emotions that ultimately block our growth and development. We all have different thoughts and feelings about our life's events, which creates deep-seated stories about our capabilities, our worth, our likability, as well as our strategies to survive and win. These stories and survival strategies become the filters through which we hear feedback and can distort the intent and meaning of the feedback we hear. When we get feedback, we are listening for how the feedback agrees or disagrees with our stories. Our stories about ourselves tell us what's possible. We look to the past for evidence that our story is true. Our stories shape what we hear in the present, and our stories create limits of what we think is possible in the future. What's worse is that what we remember and what gets created in our stories are events that didn't go well from our perspective. Think about it. When someone tells you, "Oh, great job," we tend to shrug it off. Yet when we hear, "Well, that could have gone better," that statement can ruin our day. So when someone tells us about the areas in which we can improve, you can imagine how distorted that message can get. Reflect for a moment. Where do you struggle in hearing feedback? What labels have you assigned to yourself and to your capabilities that influence how you hear feedback? You'll be challenged to reflect on this more deeply following the video. Now, let's take a look at how you can overcome this common habit and natural tendency. Understanding our uniquely personal identity triggers can help us hear and take in feedback for our growth and development. By being willing to challenge our view of who we are and letting go of the idea that we are fixed and fragile, we have the opportunity to expand our view and identify new options. When we buy into our own stories, we tend to reduce our view of ourselves to a label like, "I'm a hard worker," or "I'm dedicated," or "I'm adaptable." And when we get feedback that conflicts with that story, it creates uncertainty. Our identity is built upon how we know ourselves. Our success is dependent upon the stories we've created, and those stories can get challenged. We tend to react defensively. Consider that we are all much more than simple labels, and that our labels limit what strategies we can use to address our life's challenges. Can you recall a time when you received feedback to which you reacted strongly? What was it about the feedback that had you react so strongly? As you reflect, was there something that you could have learned from this feedback? In any given situation, we can either blame the outcome on others or we can assume that we somehow contributed to the situation. When we accept responsibility for our part, We now have the opportunity to do something about it. A question I often like to ask myself is, who am I being that this is showing up? This question helps me to be open to new ways of looking at what's happening and creating new solutions. Some strategies to help you overcome identity triggers are: hear evaluative feedback as coaching, something to consider and to try on. See if you can separate the assessment from the consequences. You personally did well, but the team didn't meet the goal. Or you achieved the goal, but we expected more from you. By separating results from evaluation, we can start to see where our identity is tripping us up. When receiving evaluation feedback that suggests areas of improvement and you get triggered, try building the habit of giving yourself a second score, a score that rates how well you received and responded to the feedback. Now let's look at the third important trigger. Let's talk about our relationship triggers. We often struggle hearing feedback in relationships if the credibility, capability, or intention of either of the person giving us the feedback is suspect. Our stories about the other person and our relationships with that person overshadow the validity of what they're saying. As we have said throughout this program, feedback can be hard to hear. How we feel about the person giving us feedback dictates our openness to it. If we feel like we've been disrespected or belittled in the past, or we think the person doesn't have the credibility to be commenting, we are quick to dismiss the feedback. Of course, that just exacerbates the difficulty in the relationship. The person giving the feedback feels invalidated, and the person receiving the feedback feels attacked. All of this quickly devolves into a finger-pointing contest, with each person blaming the other for the problem. And how we feel about the person often also overshadows how willing we are to be more accepting of their style or of their clumsiness in delivering feedback. You know, there are some people who can't tell you anything, and then there are others who you listen to with deep honor and respect. Here's a challenging question. How would you coach a person who disregards feedback they receive from their boss because they don't believe the boss really understands the depth and complexity of the issues that the person is dealing with? You'll be asked to answer that at the end of this video. When dealing with repeating patterns in a relationship, the problem is not about me or you. The challenge is at the relationship level. It needs to be addressed there. Relationship issues often boil down to differing viewpoints on a shared history between two people. Focusing on expanding each person's understanding and appreciation of each other's point of view and addressing the history and not just the latest incident can help to reestablish trust in the relationship. Switch tracks are those odd conversations where two people think they're talking about the same thing and yet they're really not. For example, a colleague has a history of coming late to meetings, seemingly unprepared. You could have many assumptions. The person is not ambitious, or they're incompetent, or lazy. In a later conversation, you give him feedback about his lack of preparedness, and he gets defensive. This, of course, makes you even more certain that he's not an A player. From his side, he's wondering why you don't understand, that he's coming from other meetings, and it just takes time to switch gears. He's frustrated with your lack of understanding, and you're frustrated with his lack of professionalism. Can you see there are two different conversations going on here? Take a moment and think of a recent conflict and ask yourself, what was really going on there? Were you two on separate tracks? To avoid switch track conversations, ask yourself, what's most important here? Is it about this particular incident or a larger pattern that has me on edge? Ask yourself, what do I really want from this relationship? Then see if you can align on what you are discussing before launching into the conversation. There's always more at play than meets the eye. Feedback may be about you, but it may also be about the style or cultural differences in the system or in the relationships within the system. You may be experiencing role clash and stepping into what someone else views as their territory. Your feedback giver may be highly triggered by their own stakeholder or job pressures. So it can be very helpful to consider your workplace system and how personal style or cultural differences and natural pressures of the larger ecosystem create pressures. Often, stepping back to take a systems viewpoint can help you uncover root causes and move you away from needless judgment. Your goal is to send the message that, one, you take responsibility for your part, and two, we're both contributing to this. This can be tricky and may need to occur in more than one conversation. If so, take responsibility first, then circle back to discuss the system and style issues that can help you both accomplish the change that's being sought. In our global workplace, we're often confronted with differences in skills, knowledge, and styles. These differences can cloud how we hear feedback from others. Appreciate that someone may have more expertise in a particular area, and what they're offering in the way of feedback is not about your competency, but rather about your relationship skills. There are a few of us without plenty of room for improvement, and we should strive to see and understand the feedback that is being offered as the gift it is. As you work on cultivating your grace in receiving feedback, here are several strategies that can help. Give up wrong spotting, the tendency to reject poorly given feedback simply because it was poorly delivered. Instead, look for the nugget of useful information that is obscured by the poor delivery. Start with the assumption that even the most difficult to hear feedback usually comes from positive intent. Try to listen with a purpose, specifically the purpose to hear feedback as the gift it is. Take ownership of your role in any situation. Although you may see the situation differently, you did have a role in the situation and you need to take 100% responsibility for your part. No matter how skillfully or bluntly the feedback is delivered, try to hear evaluative feedback as coaching, something to consider and something to help you grow and develop. Habits get built up through practice, so seek feedback often. Lastly, when receiving evaluative feedback that suggests an area of improvement and you get triggered, try building the habit of giving yourself a second score, a score that rates how well you received and responded to the feedback. The feedback may be tough to hear, but the real reward is taking the feedback in and doing something positive with it. By now, it should be obvious that we must develop skills if we want to grow and develop from feedback. We need to learn to listen with openness and curiosity as well as for themes and patterns. Is there a common thread that you're hearing in the feedback you're receiving? Sometimes people have a hard time being direct and specific. Listening for themes helps you hear the central point of what people are really trying to tell you. And to make sure you fully understand what that person is telling you, thank them for the feedback and ask them to share more. For instance, if the feedback is something like, "You always seem angry when I suggest another option," ask, "What specifically do I do that has you feeling that way?" Also ask, what's important to them? Remember, we see things through our own filters. What we think is important may not be important to the other person. Finally, be willing to be vulnerable and share areas that you're working on. Saying something like, "I know that sometimes I can appear to be stuck in my opinions, and I know that can shut down conversations. How could I show that I'm more open to different ideas or solutions?" Perhaps the best thing to do with feedback is to simply test it. Experiment with making small changes. You can always go back to the status quo. Next time you get feedback, try it on and see how it fits. Sit with the feedback in your head. Could I be coming off that way? If it doesn't fit, you can take it off, but perhaps you may decide to test it out. Try it out and see if it helps. Maybe taking an extra few minutes to ask how people are getting on, chatting about the family, or something else to build rapport. Perhaps a small change will make a big difference in how you are perceived. Remember, change is easier than we imagine. Do not catastrophize or fantasize about change. Self-awareness and emotional intelligence is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a lifetime journey, not a destination. Keep making small improvements and have fun along the way. You can make it social by finding a buddy to support you or perhaps wants to make the same change themselves. You can make it fun by tracking your success and celebrating your progress. This approach will get you much further than getting overly analytical about your leadership behavior. Another tip is to try coaching the people who most often give you feedback, especially someone like your career coach and direct manager. When you and your coach know how to respect each other's temperament and preferences, the intended value of the feedback is enhanced. When we share personal information and sensitivities, we build trust and a sense of connection with one another, which can ground our conversations. When we coach our feedback giver, we are stepping up and being responsible for what we need to grow and develop. And by the way, the coach can be anyone who provides you any type of feedback: bosses, colleagues, spouses, children's, clients, etc. Coaching the coach is creating a relationship that works for both parties and, most importantly, minimizes potential misunderstandings. Again, we all have blind spots. We do know what works for us, though. Things like, don't beat around the bush, or I may get defensive at first, but I really want the feedback, or don't ask me questions when you're looking for a specific answer, just tell me. Being clear about your triggers helps the feedback giver avoid landmines. For important feedback sources such as your boss and career coach, clarify expectations that you have for each other. Things like, how frequently will you meet? How will progress be measured? How do we adjust for changing priorities? Being clear about expectations strengthens relationships. Take a minute now to reflect on someone with whom you struggle to hear value in their feedback. How would you coach them to help you better hear, understand, and act on their feedback? Remember that a feedback culture is a learning culture. As a leader, there are a few key areas that you can focus on if you want to create a learning organization. For your organization, you should highlight learning stories every chance you get. Cultivate growth identities and mindsets in your direct reports. Hold post-mortem learning reviews for all important projects. Discuss the idea of second scores and how and what we can learn from even the most unfair of criticism. Hold frequent coaching discussions to help your people get the most from feedback. For yourself, model learning by requesting coaching and feedback for yourself on a regular basis. Manage your emotions, mindset, and identity to avoid and master your triggers and temper. Be aware of and sensitive to personality and style differences and adapt your style accordingly. You cannot have a culture of coaching unless there is also a culture that seeks feedback for the sake of learning and growing and improving. When you do achieve this kind of culture, that is a beautiful thing that nobody can take away from you. We close with this story. Yani Singh, the youngest golfer ever, male or female, to win 5 major championships, said, "Not only am I constantly seeking better performance, but also to be a better person, to be respected." Do you have a similar level of commitment to your own development? Are you committed to becoming a champion at requesting and acting upon feedback on your performance, your personality, and your leadership style? It's never too late to start. Enjoy honing your skills at gracefully receiving feedback.